Good morning. Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We are at the bottom of page 1311. And the Rabbi Rashab, after explaining the idea, what is darkness, how darkness conceals and limits and gives materialistic tangibility to whatever the neshama, the soul, and its faculties have on its own, as he explained, the faculties as they are part of the soul, and then how they manifest inside of a body and its limbs and organs. He says, Hadugma mizeh, this is an example to understand Lamaila, the idea of how Eris manifests in Kalim. So just like the soul and its faculties manifest inside of a body and its kalim, its limbs and organs, so too from that is an example to understand how it is above the Eris and kalim. And here too, like he said about cheshech, and he said about that the Evri Haguf, like it is the kalim of the human being, of the body. On one hand, it's a keli, it's an existing entity on its own. That entity is the very cheshech of its personality. And then there's this second thing, its effect on the oir, on the soul and its faculties. What's the effect? That it conceals. So here too, that's their personality. That's who they are. Like cheshech is a mitzias b'fnei atzma, not just the absence of light. It's an existing entity. And that entity is fundamentally a concealer. Would be like saying a curtain. A curtain is an existing entity, and its very nature is that it conceals. And then the gam in addition to its very personality, its effect on oir is that it conceals the oir. Now you could say it seems like a very subtle difference, but there's a big difference, because if it was only the second one, only the absence of light, only the darkener of light, then it doesn't have any entity of its own. Then it would be basically an absence of light, period. But here we're talking about something that has its own personality. And this is vital later in the discussion of transforming darkness to light. So we don't just say this world is a dark world, it darkens, it conceals the divine. It's an entity that conceals the divine. And these are the two aspects that we're discussing here. It's like we say the animal soul. The animal soul isn't just the absence of the divine soul. The animal soul is a very real entity with 10 faculties, with a root in klipas nega. It's a real soul. But in addition to what it is, it also conceals the divine, like he says here, in this case, so that's the first thing that we've established. The next thing, just to keep it in an orderly way, the next thing we learn, and where does this concealment begin? The Tchilas Salmus. It sounds to me this is the second thing, that how Keli conceals the oir. So he says it begins in the highest levels. That it conceals the energy even before the energy actually manifests in the containers. Or not before, in other words, there's an oir, as we spoke about, an oir habligvul. Okay, so in Atzilus, we're talking about oiris and kalim, there the kodesh and kalim, like in a human body, the soul and the body come together. But before Atzilus, you also have kalim, and there's also a salmus. But there, the salmus is not we're not talking about the oir within the keli being concealed. It's that the oir that is not coming into the keli is not arriving, remains. What the words I used yesterday? It recedes and remains in the background. And he gives the example of the engraved letters of the kalim of Keser. So it's not Atzilus yet; it's kalim. But it's not kalim that are separate from the oir, it's kalim that are the letters made from the stone itself, but it's already a form of machshich. There's a certain, what he says, mashchirim, es havokas ha'evan tev. that the place where you engrave the letters darken like a shadow the Even Tev. So if the Even Tev is, let's say, a sapphire or a diamond, and you engrave something in it, those letters that are engraved are not going to be as bright as the very diamond itself or the very bright stone itself. So that's Kalim of Atzilus, of Kesed. Okay, so it doesn't conceal the light within them. Like I explained yesterday, the teacher, what he's revealing to the student, there the Kalim are revealing it, because he's explaining an idea in a particular manifest way. But the ideas that are higher, that the teacher has concealed before he put the idea into Kalim, that remains concealed. So he says, and finally, what we learned, that this is an example. He gave an example. Al derech, the pu'ula of the tzimtzum that we spoke. The tzimtzum has two effects. One effect that has is on the Eir Hagvul, the intense divine energy in the hidden spheres. What's Eir Hagvul? The intensity how God envisions Chachma, Bina, Das. So there's a tzimtzum there, but there the tzimtzum is to diminish that intensity. Then there's the second effect of the tzimtzum on the Eir HaBligvul. All the infinite possibilities and everything God has had to recede, because when it's shining, it doesn't allow the defined Eir HaGvul to emerge. It's just like the teacher, when all his ideas are flowing, if they're flowing, there's no room for him to teach a particular idea to a student. Is a particular Mishnah. So he has to put aside or conceal all the wisdom that he has about everything. So there you see, so it's a helam on the bligvul, on the air that's not mislabish in the keli. And the truth is, there's also a helam on the air that comes in the keli, but that's not what he's focusing on right now. As I explained yesterday, because this whole thing is coming to explain the process of how we, who have only a very diminished revelation, can climb the ladder and retrace the steps and reconnect all the way to the highest levels of the divine. That's the punchline. So that's where we're up to, the last line on the page. The parentheses is where I stopped, which I'm going to learn right now. But before I continue, because this is a little dense, if anybody wants me to clarify anything, I'm happy to do so. Okay, so now the Rebbe Rashab is going to qualify that though I just gave an example from the Tzimtzum, that it affects the concealment and the removal. Removal here means total concealment of the bligvul, yet he's going to distinguish between the Tzimtzum and the Kalim. Even though he used this comparison, because he wanted to give a comparison, he says, Rak, however, this is a qualification. Shebet Tzimtzum Arishin, in that first great Tzimtzum, Zehu, page 1312, next page. Zehu Mupulas HaTzimtzum. There, it's a superimposed force of the effect of the Tzimtzum. The Eir was shining infinitely and unfettered and unbound, and was the word of seamlessly. And the Tzimtzum then came. This is God's power to bring the Tzimtzum. The Tzimtzum conceals that powerful energy. Al Kain, hu b'chinas siluk legamri. And that's why it's a complete removal, or a complete concealment would be the right translation, or the right meaning. Siluk means removal, but really means concealment. The Maimon Vayikra Moshe, this is in volume 2. They refer to page 513. I'm sorry, 913. Tov Kuf Yud Gimel. That's 913. I'd have to look up what it says there. So that's from the pool of the Tzimtzum. Or the Kalim, by contrast, however, the Kalim Hushei Salmus Nasim and Mela. Al Kain Eina B'chinas Silik Legamri V'Yachal is B'chinas Gili. Let's explain what this means. By Kalim, on the other hand, it's not through a pu'ula. It's not through a particular, tzimtzum is an action, and a deliberate effort to conceal. Kalim, he says, it comes automatically. As soon as you have Kalim, you don't need to make any deliberate effort. A pu'ula, it happens automatically. And therefore, it's not complete concealment. And it's possible there should be gili. We need to explain what this means. It's very big kitzur, so that's why I wanted to just think about it for a moment. Maybe it would be helpful to look in volume 2 in Vayikra. Well, what comes to mind, what I think is saying here, if I recall correctly, I mentioned it yesterday, that you know what? I'm going to look just at volume 2. Maybe helpful. Just a second. I have it. Oh, there. 1 minute. I want to just look inside for a moment, just glance. Maybe it'll be helpful. Because there's a few things that come to mind. I don't want to make a mistake. Yeah, the mimers. Okay. See one more thing in boy. That's Vayikra Ayin Hey. I want to see a mimer boy where he says, okay. Sorry about that, but I just wanted to see inside. The way I would explain this parentheses is as follows. Number one, I think 2 points I want to make. I mentioned yesterday, and I want to say it again, there's 2 ways to conceal something. You choose to conceal it. Let's say I want to say something to you right now, but I want to hold back certain things. So I just hold it back. And that's a pu'ulas atzimtzum. That's a very powerful thing that a person can, for example, when you're speaking, you don't have to say everything that's on your heart and mind. And for whatever reason, either because of the student can't hear it or whatever reason, you hold back certain things. So just like you have the power to reveal, you have the power to conceal. That's the pool of tzimtzum. There's another thing. God created kalim. Kalim is a real entity. This entity is not your active effort right now to conceal. It's a creation of something that has the power to conceal. Like I mentioned, you could, for example, if there's light shining through your window, you can just close your eyes. Or you could put up a curtain. And it's very different. Because you put up a curtain, even though closing the eyes, you could say, is also like a curtain. But still, it's you are choosing not to look. But when you put up a curtain, it's an automatic process. The curtain is created for that purpose, to automatically conceal or diminish the light from entering through the window. So what he's saying here is the difference is both of them do concealing, but one's job is only concealing. And the other is an entity. He says that it comes to Kalim, the line is, it's what happened to it? Top of page 1312. The Kalim Sheisamas Nasa Mamela. Mamela means different than a pu'ula. It's not an action. It happens automatically. As soon as there's kalim, there's a certain amount. Like when you have a vadim of the body, you don't need to do anything extra to conceal. The very containers of your limbs and organs will conceal some of the energy within the soul. When a teacher is concealing his brilliance, it's not because it's manifesting in something, it's he chooses to conceal. That's how I think I would explain it. Now, what about the second half? The Pulasat Simtsum, because it's an action and God wants to conceal the bligvul, so it completely conceals it. The Kalim, on the other hand, because it's already in place, he's saying, that's why, for example, if you're talking about the Tzimtzum of a teacher concealing his brilliance, he conceals it completely. When you're talking about once you dress up the Ur and the Keli, like the faculties come inside the body, you can't say it's complete concealment. You say there's a concealment, but it's on a lower qualitative and quantitative level, that the soul's way of understanding godliness inside the body is not on the same level as it understands it without a body, but you can't say it's completely concealed. There is some revelation going on. When you look with your eyes, with a physical eye, yes, you can't see infinitely, endlessly, like it is the power of Riyah without the physical eye, but you can't say there's no revelation at all. So Keli has in the two a quality as advantage and a disadvantage. Well, I don't want to say disadvantage, because it's happening mamela, therefore it's not the same thing like the pu'ula of a tzimtzum. The tzimtzum role has a very definite, deliberate role to conceal completely, whereas the Keli's role is something to be there to create some concealment, but not necessarily completely conceal. Now, I'm not positive with everything I just said, to be honest, because it's so short. It's hard for me to fully say this is what he wants to say, but this appears to me what he's trying to say right here in this parentheses. The bigger question is, why is this relevant? Why does he want to make this distinction? So maybe this will become apparent when we learn further. But that covers the parentheses. Again, if anybody wants to ask anything, I'm happy to answer. That's what it seems to me is the pshat in this short parentheses on the top of the bottom of page 1311. We now move to 1312. Okay. Now we're going to go slowly here. So far we've established that the Kalim have two things in them, that they're fundamentally Helam be'etzem uhusam, like we discussed yesterday, because they are about creating substance, and they're also about creating a relationship with another. So they have an identity, and they also conceal the eris and limit them that enter into the keli. Of course, it's interdependent, these two things, but they are two things in the keli. One is the keli itself, and one is its effect on the eir. Now, as far as the keli itself or the effect on the eir, I'm not sure. As I said, the next line, the tchila says salmus, sounds like the effect is all the way in the highest level, like we just said, that it hides the blig vul. So now the Rebbe Rashab is going to continue and talk about how the kelim and the eris interact, and you'll see shortly how he's going to bring it back to what we discussed earlier. So I think it's going to reconnect. It'll be easier to understand. Right now, he's moved to that other higher dimension of the er ha-blig vul, and he says the following. So I'm reading now the third line on page 1312. The pages can be found if you want to follow the text at ayinbeis.com. So he says, the ima yes, and even though shezeu b'chinas ha'er makif, shelamayla ma'er pnimi, and even though this er that we're talking about, that recedes and gets concealed through the kelim, like through the tzimtzum, with the qualification we just discussed in the parentheses, even though that's called the er makif, that's higher than the er pnimi. The er that enters into the keli is called the er pnimi. And there they join together and they unite. Whereas now we're talking about the er makif. So ima yesh shezel er makif. And therefore, what's the question? What's the qualification? Meaning it's not really relevant to the keli. I'm not sure. Let me read on and we'll see. Now, he called it er makif before he called it er ha-blig vul. So he says in the parentheses, this er makif that is now receded due to the tzimtzum. What is it? The er before the tzimtzum that's the er ha-blig vul. After the tzimtzum, it's called er makif. So in other words, it's the er that's higher than what manifests in containers. So basically he's saying, so what's the concealment? It's not an er that is relating to the structure of existence. It remains transcendent and beyond. B'kol mokem harimeir b'bchinas er pnimi. Okay, I'll explain this. Let me read the sentence and then I'll explain. Nevertheless, it radiates into the immanent and internalized energy. Because the er pnimi, where does it arrive from? The er pnimi is drawn from and rooted in the er makif, in the transcendent energy, boy, and it's encompassed in it. Ukamoi ha'esesphiris. I'm going to read inside and then I'll explain. Haklulim bekeser, like the 10 spheres that are encompassed in keser. Remember before we said there's the keser, like the letters, the engraved letters. Shemeir behem b'chinas er makif. In them radiate the transcendent er makif. Ukamoi be'esesphiris ha'gnuzah shekedim ha'tzimtzum, like the 10 hidden spheres prior to the tzimtzum. Meir b'chinas er shebe'ein sof u'blig vul. In them radiate the eir that's within the Ein Sof and the blig vul, the infinite energy. U'kamoshin is bar le'il ba'erech. As it was explained earlier at length. Let me explain this now. Now, one second, one more sentence. One more phrase. V'ayidei isfapshus b'kelin. And through the manifesting within containers, mis'alim ha'er hazeh. This energy gets concealed. One second here. Okay, let me go back to the analogy of the artist, because this seems very some little cryptic and dense. But I think when we dissect this, and I'm going to use the example of the artist, it'll be far more understood. I mentioned it yesterday, and I elaborated a bit. I want to elaborate again. Remember that all this is coming to explain ultimately the interface between us and God, between existence and God. The problem is that existence is a completely structured, finite entity. Everything is finite in this world. It's limited. It's a large universe and has a multitude of species and details, but still it's structure. When you talk about godliness, elikus, in its purest form, it's completely beyond structure. No definitions, no parameters, no finite realities, and so on. And yet the Eibishter has the power to create the finite. So here's the question, and this is a very critical question. From our point of view, we live in a finite universe, and our question that we have is, can we connect to the infinite? Can we connect to that which is beyond our own ceiling, so to speak? Or do we have a ceiling, a glass ceiling, and that you reach it and that's it, we can't go higher? That's a legitimate question. But let's ask the question the other way around. God is infinite and beyond infinite. And the question is, can God manifest in any way and relate to the finite? For us, the challenge is, can the finite reach heaven and beyond? Can we touch the sky? From God's perspective, you can ask the question, can God relate to existence? Now, philosophers and even Mukobolim had challenges with this. Because if God is completely beyond anything that is mortal, that is finite, that is temporary, then how could he connect to a temporary existence like ours? An existence of time and space, which is why you have some philosophers who argue that God remains in his domain, and we don't really have a relationship with him. He created existence, they'll acknowledge that, and that's it. And he leaves it for the stars or for his messengers to run the show. But to have a true relationship between us and God in his purest form, you could argue that it doesn't make sense. We're too far apart. Now, in Kabbalah itself, you'll find some Kabbalim who lean toward that the way to connect to God is by divesting ourselves of our finite garments, basically through bittul and through sublimation. And therefore, we can then be encompassed and absorbed in a higher infinite state, but we have to lose our identities. Or the other way around. Our identities become divine, but never to the divine essence that's beyond the finite. It relates to godliness as it relates to us. So it doesn't seem like you could have the best of both worlds. Either it's on our terms, or it's on God's terms. If it's on God's terms, we need to divest of our finite structures to some extent. If it's on our terms, God cannot be completely immersed and engaged with us on his terms. He has to somewhat bend down to our level. It would be like, again, a brilliant teacher and a student. And without talking about growth, either the teacher has to come down to the level of the student, or the student has to lose his identity and be absorbed in the identity of the higher consciousness of the teacher. But Chassidus makes it very clear that we want the best of both. We want God in his purest and uncompromised form, and we want the human being and existence. Dire b'tachtenim. Dire b'tachtenim. Just to make the point, drive the point even further home, let's take the difference of the opinions between the Rambam and the Ramban regarding the future. But the Rambam says the ultimate reward will be in Gan Eden. Neshama is divested of bodies. A neshama without a body. And the reasoning is very simple. The body, with all its virtues, limits the soul. We just elaborated from Tanya chapter 37. And in general, the soul within a body has to be limited because spirituality, unfettered, is far more superior than it is within a body. So the Rambam says that even though Hashem wanted us to come into this world and do mitzvahs in a physical world, but ultimately the physical world and the body will be rewarded a short period of time with chiyas hamesim, resurrection of the bodies. So the body gets the reward that it had for working together with the soul in refining this world and doing mitzvahs, but the ultimate reward will be that the body will then again disappear and it'll be neshamas into the endless future, because the neshama is a spiritual entity, therefore it could forever enjoy the delights of the divine Ein Sof. Using words of Kabbalah, it's not the words of the Rambam, but that's the idea. The Ramban, Nachmanides, very different opinion, that the ultimate reward is Tchis HaMesim, Neshamas Begufim, and that will be forever. Now, how do you explain that? I mean, the Rambam's logic seems to be impeccable. And Chassidus brings that Tzemach Tzedek says that the Alter Rebbe, wherever you see the Maimorim, always goes with the shita of the Ramban. No, it's Chassidus paskins like the Ramban, not like the Rambam. And what's the logic? The logic is because God is not limited by spirituality. If you think spirituality is the end of it all, yes, spirituality is superior to materialism, to the material world. But God is neither bli gvul nor gvul. He's not closer to bli gvul than he is to gvul. He's not closer to ruchnius than he is to gashmis. So really, there are three stages. There's gashmis, which is finite compared to ruchnius, but then there's atzmus, which is higher than gashmis and ruchnius, and ultimately it's the yesh hanivra of the body that's created by atzmus, whereas all the oidos and giluyim of ruchnius, even though they are in giluyim, they're infinite and therefore superior to the material world, but they don't have the power of atzmus quite the same way. And the Eibishter wants both together. So it's the neshama and the guf, spirit and matter that join together and reveal to us the third dimension of atzmus, which is beyond both. Now you'll say, what's all this to do with anything we're learning here? Everything. You'll see now the connection. So once we know this, so now the goal is not just to reach a divine level that we relate to, and the other extreme where we connect to the divine in God's terms, but we have to divest ourselves and essentially compromise or annihilate our individuality and identities and the structure of existence. Dira b'tachtenim means the two opposites. Dira lo yizborach la'atzmusei is the diuk in the Maimorim from the Alter Rebbe and on. That it's a home for atzmus, not just for levels of the divine that are lower than that. And it's in tachtenim, plural. So both extremes, the atzmus and the tachtenim, and with all the ruchnius in between that we just explained. So it's neshama and a guf, but also reaching a third level, which we're going to ultimately understand when we understand the transformation of the keli and the darkness itself to light. That's going to ultimately lead us to the third point. Meanwhile, you talk about Eir and keli, so the Eir reveals, the keli conceals. Why? Because at the end of the day, to create tachtenim, you have to have concealing. After everything I've just said, the Rambam is not completely incorrect. Of course, ruchnius is more intense than gashmis. That everybody agrees. The question is whether atzmus is limited to that. So now, bringing it back to the theme here, I want to use the example with the artist. So when you talk about the process of creation, everyone agrees that you have to have a tzimtzum, because there's no way you can create a finite existence as long as the infinite energy is flowing. Atzmus can do whatever he wants, and he can create the yesh, but he wanted it to be in a way that's logical. So on one hand, the infinite energy will always overwhelm the finite. If you put infinity and finite together, what's going to happen? The finite will be completely disappear within the infinite, because the finite is part of it. So going back to the analogy of the artist has the capacity to create all kinds of things, even not art. He chooses to express his art, his artistry. In his art itself, he has infinite possibilities to create all types of art. And then he chooses to create one type of art, the world as we know it. Eser Svidus, Asara Maimoris. One picture. It's a very complex picture, but it's one picture. One of infinite possibilities. And those infinite possibilities are also only part of what God is capable of doing, because he's not limited to being an artist. We, on the receiving end, only relate to that one piece of art, that one structure. But the goal is that we should travel, and we want to go all the way into the infinite possibilities and the infinite of the infinite, meaning even beyond that, where God is not even limited by art altogether. And more than that, he's not even limited by the infinite, as I mentioned. So here's how it works. The infinite possibilities of the artist encompass every possibility, including the spheres. You can't say if a person, before he decides, the artist, before he decides, I'm going to create a particular landscape or a particular portrait, whatever it is he's choosing to make, all that, before he chooses which one he's going to draw, he already has all the possibilities included in that infinite reality. So the bli gvul includes every type of gvul, including the spheres. They're all there. One problem, however, if it remains there, it's completely overwhelming, meaning it would be like objects inside of an endless ocean. You need to have the bli gvul concealed to allow this one defined art he wants to create. That's what he's saying here. So what has to happen? What has to happen is that even though the bli gvul includes all that gvul, you have to conceal it. But even when you conceal it, it still was the source of where that gvul came from. So when you look at one piece of art, the truth is, even though you only see that one piece of art, 10 spheres, and you may not know it yet, but when you start traveling through Avodah, you start growing, you come to realize that's one of a whole picture of bli gvul. So the truth is, the gvul is going to ultimately connect you to the bli gvul. So even though at this point it's concealed, the bli gvul from the gvul, but nevertheless, it's going to lead you there. And that's what he's saying here. That, and I'll read it inside now, you'll see how the whole thing comes alive. So he says like this. And even though this energy that has receded now, been concealed due to the kalim and the tzimtzum in a form of makiv, so it has no relationship to us, seemingly. The kol mokim, and that's called the which is called bli gvul. The kol mokim had a meir b'chinas pnimi. It's still radiating in the pnimi, it's just concealed. It's what's informing the artist's infinite possibilities, is informing the finite that he chose to create. Because this pnimi, this invested energy that God is, the artist is investing in creating this particular structure, which is the pnimi, where does it come from? It came from the makiv, v'kolol boy, and it's encompassed in it. And then the parentheses he drives the point home. The 10 spheres in Atzilus are encompassed in Keser. There, you sense the makiv in Keser. And even higher, the 10 hidden spheres, before the Tzimtzum, in them radiate the bli gvul of the infinite spheres. The infinite possibilities radiate within the 10 spheres. That's why you need to conceal it. Because if you don't conceal it, it won't emerge. And that's what the Tzimtzum and Kalim do. They conceal. It conceals this higher dimension of the bli gvul to allow the gvul to manifest and emerge. Now, we still haven't talked about the Tzimtzum of the Eiris in the Kalim. This is all the that recedes to allow for to enter into Kalim, to allow the art to be created. If the artist was completely consumed with his infinite possibilities, he wouldn't have the presence of mind and the composure to even create art. You see this when a person, let's say writing or an artist, when the flow of consciousness is literally unlimited, they can't limit themselves. They can't even put down a certain particular image. The story about the Maggid or the Mittler Rebbe, they say that he would sometimes speak Torah, he would say, Shah still. Why did he say Shah still? Be quiet. He was telling his mind, the mind was a Nevias HaMeichin, was flowing endlessly, and he was telling the mind, slow down, quiet. Because when the mind is flowing without any tzimtzum or kalim, it overwhelms, it's like a flood. It floods you, and you can't define anything to be explained. It's like when a person, you ever see a genius start speaking and they don't know how to limit themselves, they go on so quickly, nobody understands a word they're saying. So that's why the Mittler Rebbe would say, Shah still. Some say, I think it's on the Maggid as well, I think I recall correctly, which means he's like quieting his mind. He's quieting his mind to limit the flow. So in other words, So in other words, what you need to have is the tzimtzum, but to say that the Eir HaGvul does not come from the Eir Makif, Eir HaBli, that's not correct. And that's what he's explaining now. So we're not talking about now the Eiris and the Kalim. We're talking about what happens, like he said, the Psalmist, he began, Tchilas Psalmist. Where did it first begin? Was first concealing all the Bligvul to allow the Gvul to emerge. And that's the meaning of what we just learned. By Yidei Slapshus, B'Kalim Misalim Ha'Eir Hazeh. And by manifesting in Kalim, this Eir Bligvul, this higher Eir, gets concealed. That's like the artist as he's focusing, or the writer as he's writing down a particular sentence or a particular chapter or book. So then that Eir is concealed, even though it informs and in it is encompassed everything that is being created right now. So the Gvul is really just an expression, like he said in volume 1 in the beginning, one of the big Chidushim, that Shiur Atzmei B'Koyach, in the infinite possibilities, God chose one. So the one possibility really is just the edge of Bli Gvul, but we're only seeing one piece of it. It's a piece of Bli Gvul, basically, that looks like Gvul, not just looks like it is Gvul. So Gvul is really a piece of Bli Gvul, like he said there, Konof and Min Konof, if you may remember. By Tzitzis, the strings, the fringes, the strings of Tzitzis have to be made from Min Konof, the same material, like the wool, of the beged, of the garment. But Min Konof, Veloy Konof Atzme, you can't go and take a beged, a garment, and just take a knife or scissors and cut eight sections in the corner. Then it's not detached. It has to be detached of the same material, but detached. So he explained there that that's the idea of Gvul and Bli Gvul. It has to be it's coming from Bli Gvul, but it has to be its own entity. So that's what he explained there. So the Konof there is the Bli Gvul. I'm sorry, the beged is the Bli Gvul, the garment, and the Konof, the edge where the tzitzis are bound to, that's the Gvul that comes from the Bli Gvul. That's how he explained it there. So the Tzimtzum, therefore, now conceals the Bli Gvul to allow the Gvul to emerge, but in the Gvul is embedded all the infinite possibilities, and therefore, when through our Aveda, we will be able to connect to those infinite possibilities all the way up to the highest levels that we'll ultimately discuss. But this is still Eiris and Kalim, not the Kali itself, as it relates to the Helam Ha'atzmi and to the very core essence of the power of concealment. We're talking here the process of how Eir and Kali work with each other, that the Kali is concealing the Eir, like the Cheshech that conceals the light, the darkness that conceals the light. So that's where we're up to right now. The last line I read, stops of the Kali Misalama Eir Hazeh. Now,
can you take a question?
1 minute, let me finish my sentences. You don't need to ask me. I remember my own rule, which is when I finish after every section, I will stop for questions just for the point record. So now, I hope this helped understand the analogy, understand the whole context of what he's coming to explain here. There's plenty more to come, so it's not over yet. He's going to still talk about now the different levels of Eiris and Kalim, how they work with each other. But a lot of what I said here, well, most of what I just said is informed by he keeps seeing, you see, commission is bar le'il ba'erech, commission is bar le'il. He's already referred several times to what he discussed earlier, and he's not just saying that as a line. He's saying it because what I just summed up is what we discussed at length back then. Those of you maybe remember, maybe you don't remember, but a lot of the points I made here are not the first time I discussed this. So it's not the first time we spoke about this topic. So now I will stop if anybody wants to ask any questions.
So I have a question about the difference, the distinction between or makif and or pnimi, and how or pnimi results or from or makif, what she says here, is this sort of like or pnimi is the or it's in the keli and it's filled by the or makif. So let's say a waterfall with a rush of water, and then there's, let's say, a cup, and the or makif is all this overflowing amount of water flowing over the waterfall, and the or pnimi is the only the or that gets captured within the keli. Is that a fair mashal?
I wouldn't use that mashal. I would use the example I gave with the artist was more accurate. If that mashal helps you understand something in it, it's fine, but it's not exactly here, because he's not talking about overflowing, and he's not, the waterfall and the water in the cup are relate to each other, and you could see it. It's just one is entering the cup and part of it is not able to enter the cup. So it has certain things that I would not really use for this example. But the examples I gave were the ones I would use. But examples are only as good as what you want to use them for. If you want to just use it to understand the relationship between the water in the cup and the water outside the cup, to some extent. But there's a lot of dissimilarities. Whereas the example of the infinite possibilities of art and one possibility called the 10 spheres, to me, is much more accurately conveying what he wants to say here.
But again, remember, I'm trying to drill down on the difference between...
is not a waterfall. Makiv is an energy that is not apparent and not aware of us. It's beyond us. It remains completely it's something we don't have direct access to. Like he says in chapter 48 in Tanya, what Makiv means. Also keep in mind that he said Makiv before the Tzimtzum is Bligvul. What I was discussing was also explaining the 10 spheres in context to Bligvul. So there's Pnimi and Makiv, and there's Bligvul and Bligvul. They have a relationship, obviously, because one is rooted in the other. Makiv and Pnimi is also after the Tzimtzum. Bligvul and Gvul is more before the Tzimtzum, but it's the same idea.
Okay, so you cannot have an or Makiv.
I mean, why? Let me ask you a question. What is your question that you're trying to give another example for? When you give an example should always be used to answer something or to explain something. I gave an example with the art or with writing. If you can tell me what's inadequate in that example, I can then maybe comment. I'm not sure why what this example is coming to resolve.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to understand is previously I had understood or Makiv and or Pnimi as essentially different types of or. But he's saying here that or Pnimi is coming from or Makiv. It's just that which is in a finite realm. It's in a keli. They're not. Or isn't different. Or is or, but or Pnimi is that exactly which we can.
That's not exactly what he said, but okay.
Well, I'm trying to understand.
So I go back to my analogy. Use the analogy of the artist is the closest analogy I can find for it. The relationship between the infinite possibilities and the finite, and the one the artist chooses, and the connection between that choice, which is one of all the infinite possibilities. That's
right, but you can have an or Makiv in the finite realm, right? You can have an or Makiv that comes down to Asiya, and we can't relate to it. We have to define what.
I'm not sure what you mean by that. What means Makiv? If you say transcendent energy by definition does not manifest in containers. It remains above them and beyond them. So when you say you could have it, what do you mean that you could have it? What does that mean?
Well, a mitzvah is Ratzon Hashem, and as I understand it, the Ratzon
let's put it this way. I don't want to look. Let me put it this way. Makiv is a topic in Chassidus that probably is not thousands of pages, hundreds of pages. There's a lot about Makiv. In Ayin Beis, there's around, after he finishes with Pnimi, is around 50, 60 pages where he explains what Makiv is. So being this is Ayin Beis, that's where he elaborates what Makiv is. Yes, a mitzvah is Mamshech Makiv, but that's Avodah. We're not talking about Avodah now. We're not talking about things we were given by God to draw down. We're talking about Makiv in the process of creation, in the process of creating art. So that's the first distinction. So I understand the temptation to bring together everything you learned about it, but you have to remember the dynamics here is he's talking here about creation before Avodah, not how we draw the Makiv, but how God uses the Makiv in the process of creation. And that's where the example of the artist is a good example, in my opinion, or other examples that are similar to that. The process of where the Makiv gets concealed, like he's saying here, with the Kalim conceal. Then there's another track, and that's a track of Avodas Adam, where we begin to now, in a created world, La'avda L'Shamra, to begin to draw down, like we learned at length, we draw energy into Gan Eden, more than what creation has on its own. So here we're talking about the actual process of creation and the dynamics of what is revealed, what's not revealed, and how God creates, like an artist creating art.
Okay, thank you. Helpful.
Okay. Are there any other questions? And I mean, look, this topic of that the Ur HaGvul, like he said here, the come from there is a chiddush that goes back, I believe, to chapter 27 in Ayin Beis, volume 1, if I recall correctly. And this is a topic that keeps returning in Ayin Beis because it's a key to the interface, is where Bli Gvul and Gvul meet. That ultimately Gvul is a piece of Bli Gvul. But we don't know that until we go through our Avodah and so on. So this is a recurrent topic that I've talked about, in my recollection, hundreds of times. So it's definitely in all the recordings, especially in the earlier parts of Ayin Beis. And I tried to explain it here, sum it up to some extent. Are there other questions? Any other questions? Okay. Now, the next section, which I'm going to just give an introduction and then we'll stop here. The next section is going to break it down further. Remember, the whole point here is trying to explain how Eris and Kalim interact with each other. We're not talking about transformation. We're not talking about even radiating the darkness. We're talking about just how Kalim and Eris work. Like he said, with the body, before the example, was the Keiches HaNefesh, the faculties of the soul and the soul itself, as a manifest inside of a body. So he's now making that comparison. Remember, this whole paragraph began, Adugma calls it, Adugma is a Yuval Lamaila, Beslapshus Ha'eris B'Kalim. So the first thing he's doing is making the comparison between Eris and Kalim to the Keiches HaNefesh and the Evrei HaNefesh, the faculties of the soul into the limbs or organs of the human being. So we're still developing that, and he's now going to go to the next section. He's going to move. He started with the Hisalmus, begins with the concealment of the Bli Gvul or the Makif. Now he's going to go into Pnimi itself. You also have stages of how Eris and Kalim interact with each other and how the concealment manifests. And then he's going to bring it back to what we were discussing. I think it'll be, but I see here, it'll be understood once we finish this paragraph. What I do see here that the Rebbe Rashab is definitely tying together the beginning of Ayin Beis, big parts of it. He's now going to tie together shortly a big part of volume 2 with the Eibush to Asa Kamet Tzimtzumim. And it's really all part of the flow of Ayin Beis. If you keep in mind the central theme, and I will point that out when we learn it inside, you'll see he's really connecting all the pieces before the big puzzle here. This is one of the pages where I've mentioned many times where you see the Rebbe Rashab is very deliberately making all the knots to make sure that the flow of Ayin Beis is flowing. There are times when the Rebbe Rashab is discussing a topic, but then he comes at the end of the topic and connects it to the things we learned earlier. We've seen, I pointed it out several times. It's usually indicated when he starts quoting a lot of earlier Maimonim. That's usually a sign that he's binding it all together. He's not just quoting to give us a Maramokam, a source. He's showing that this is all part of that central theme. So remember, Ayin Beis is one long hemshech. It's one long flow. So even though it's made up of hundreds and hundreds of different themes and subplots and sub-themes, etc., but it's really all comes together. And this is one of those sections where he's tying together. I remember pointing out at least 3-4 times before where you see that happening, both in volume 3 and volume 2. I usually mark it, my own notes, I usually mark that that's a section because those are the junctures, which are like, the intersections. It's like when you're riding on a road, you want to know where two roads intersect. So there are places in Ayin Beis where you see these intersections, where he's connecting all the themes of that he's discussed earlier with what he's talking about now, which frankly is the key to keeping a cohesive picture of the whole structure of Ayin Beis from its beginning. And to me, memorizing that is critical in understanding the whole jigsaw puzzle here. So that's one of the sections we're learning right now. He's doing exactly that. Okay. Any final questions for this class?
Rabbi Jacobson, in volume 1, if my memory serves me correctly, you also explained that there's a blending, meaning that when you're coming from top down, but between Or and Kali, there's a lot more Or and less Kali, as if it were. And as you come down the levels, is because the Kali becomes more apparent and less of the Or. I think you discussed that in volume 1, and I think that's helpful to understand this also. That it's all about the blending. It's not an absolute thing.
I agree. And as a matter of fact, I think the next section we're going to learn tomorrow alludes to that to some extent. But yes, it's correct that there is that. That's like exactly like the soul's faculties come inside the body. Also, that in the higher level where it's only the faculties and only the soul, it's far more pure and abstract. And as it comes into the containers, it becomes more tangible and more palpable. So it's correct what you're saying. That's a good point. Yeah. Okay. So we'll stop here by the word ubeprotius. It's 3, 6, 7 lines from the top of the page. 13, 12. And